USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer that earned a legendary place in the history of the United States Navy for her heroic actions on the morning of October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Samar. Despite being vastly outgunned and outnumbered by a superior Japanese fleet, Johnston fiercely helped defend the vulnerable American escort carriers she had been tasked with protecting. Her courageous crew showed such incredible valor during the action that even the Japanese showed great respect toward them as their ship slipped beneath the waves. The sacrifice made by her and her men, along with that of several other U.S. warships, saved countless other sailors and ultimately the Leyte beachhead, as the Japanese were forced to turn away short of their objective. Johnston's keel was laid down on May 6, 1942, and she was launched in late March of 1943. She had the specifications and armament of a typical Fletcher-class destroyer. Johnston was commissioned into the United States Navy on October 27, 1943, with Commander Ernest E. Evans in command. Evans would be her commander for the duration of her career, and any mention of Johnston or her actions cannot go on without first talking about her legendary commanding officer. Commander Evans was a short, barrel-chested man, with a lineage that included both Creek and Cherokee Indian blood. He was born in Pawnee, Oklahoma in 1908 and was a 1931 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He was said to have had a warlike temperament, and indeed, upon the commissioning of Johnston, he stated bluntly, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." This attitude was not only born out of his warrior mentality, but also the early days of the war in the Pacific. Evans had been the executive officer of the World War I-era Clemson-class destroyer Alden, which was forced to flee Java after the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942. By all accounts, that retreat remained foremost on his mind, and he was determined to never run away from the enemy again. After her shakedown cruise and initial training, she found herself in the Marshall Islands in late January 1944, providing fire support for the numerous amphibious invasions going on within the island group. On the 31st, she shelled the island of Melu. The next day, she entered Kwajalein Lagoon and provided fire support for the assault on Roy Namor. In February, Johnston supported operations at Eniwetok Atoll, where she screened the heavier support ships and provided fire support from the 17th to the 22nd. After a short stint on carrier escort duty, Johnston patrolled the northern Solomons and New Guinea area from March to May. On May 16th, while off Buka Island, she had a hand in sinking the Japanese submarine I-176. In June, she shifted to supporting operations in the Mariana Islands. From July 21st to August 1st, Johnston aided in the recapture of Guam by firing more than 4,000 5-inch rounds in support of the Marines and GIs ashore. During the initial landings on the 21st, Commander Evans maneuvered Johnston as close to the beach as possible, ahead of the leading assault waves, to provide adequate fire support. He believed this move reduced personnel casualties on the landing beaches considerably, since the Japanese took the ship, and not the landing force, under fire in that sector. It also enabled his gunnery officer to locate undisclosed enemy positions and employ counter-battery fire to destroy them. After minor repairs in August, her next assignment was screening escort carriers providing air support for the invasion and capture of the Palau Islands. On October 12th, Johnston got underway with Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3, of Task Force 77 for the invasion of Leyte. On the 18th, her unit began furnishing air support for the preliminary bombardment of Leyte. As U.S. forces returned to the Philippines, the Japanese prepared a reception, for what remained of the Japanese fleet was already underway at this point to contest the landings. On the morning of October 25th, Johnston was steaming east of the island of Samar as part of the anti-submarine screen for Taffy 3. At about 6:50, Johnston was alerted that the task unit was being pursued by a Japanese surface force that was just over the horizon and out of sight. This force was under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita and consisted of 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship afloat, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. General quarters soon rang out on Johnston as the task unit proceeded east towards a rain squall while laying smoke and launching planes. With his stacks already spouting out thick black smoke, Evans ordered the smoke screen generator detail to begin making chemical smoke as well. As Johnston was at the rear of the U.S. formation, she was the closest ship to the approaching enemy. Realizing this, Evans turned his ship towards the Japanese at flank speed to make a torpedo attack to cover his task unit's escape. As she began her run towards the enemy force, she immediately came under fire from the Japanese battleships Nagato and Haruna, but neither managed to score any hits on her. At 7:10, Johnston opened fire when the nearest Japanese heavy cruiser, the Kumano, came within range of her 5-inch battery. Kumano and her sister ship, Suzuya, fired off numerous salvos, but again, just like the battleships, neither managed to hit the destroyer. In contrast, Johnston fired more than 200 5-inch shells at Kumano over the next 5 minutes and struck the cruiser at least 45 times, setting her superstructure on fire. Then, having closed to 10,000 yards, Johnston let loose all 10 of her torpedoes at Kumano and turned sharply to hide in her own smoke. At least one of these hit Kumano, which forced her to retire with her sister Suzuya as her escort. Not long after, Johnston was rocked by a near miss from a 14-inch shell fired by the battleship Congo, which sprayed red dye all over her hull. At this point, as Johnston dashed back to the escort carriers, Commander Evans had forced 2 heavy cruisers out of the engagement without being hit by a single Japanese projectile. But this luck would not last for long, for at about 7:30, as Johnston emerged from the smoke she was in, she was struck by 3 18.1-inch shells fired by Yamato, in addition to a salvo of 6.1-inch shells from the battleship's secondary battery. The 18-inch shells knocked out both her aft fire room and engine room, all power to her 5-inch mounts, all power to her steering engine and her gyro compass. Her speed fell to 17 knots. The 40mm directors on her aft stack were knocked out, and her SG radar had been snapped off. 2 6.1-inch shells hit her bridge on the port side, with one passing aft of the port side torpedo director and the other exploding on contact. This explosion killed Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph B. Pliska as he stood next to Commander Evans, who emerged minus his helmet, shirt, and 2 of his fingers. When Johnston's medical officer reached the bridge to tend to him, Evans sent him to treat those more seriously wounded, before wrapping a handkerchief around the bloody stumps of his fingers. A rain squall then gave Johnston some temporary relief and provided her with 10 minutes to evaluate the catastrophic damage she had just received. Her FD radar was soon back in operation, as were her forward 5-inch guns. She then attempted to rejoin Taffy 3, but as she did, Johnston encountered the destroyers Howell, Heermann, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts as they were making their own torpedo attacks. Although Johnston had already fired all 10 of her torpedoes and was heavily damaged, she slid in astern of the boiling wakes of her squadron mates to provide fire support for them. At about 8:40, Heermann and Johnston nearly collided in the dense smoke of the battle as they returned towards the carriers. Johnston soon picked up Congo at about 7,000 yards and fired 35-inch shells at her. Johnston then attempted to intervene in the plight of the escort carrier Gambier Bay, dead in the water and listing badly to port. Johnston attempted to draw fire from her by firing on her main aggressor, the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Johnston then turned her attention towards enemy destroyers that were closing on the escort carriers rapidly. Sighting them at about 10,000 yards, Johnston opened fire on their leader, the light cruiser Yahagi. For the next half hour, Johnston alternated between engaging the cruisers on the port side of the carriers and the destroyers on their starboard side, in a desperate attempt to keep all of them from closing on the vulnerable escort carriers. She was struck by enemy ordnance numerous times during this period. A shell hit Radio Central, killing or wounding every man there, and another set fire to a 40mm magazine. Ammunition began cooking off, and dense smoke resulted from these hits. At about 9:20, Commander Evans made his way aft to con Johnston's movements from her fantail. Johnston found herself at about 9:30, with 2 enemy cruisers dead ahead, several destroyers off her starboard quarter, and 2 more cruisers off her port quarter. An avalanche of shells in the ensuing minutes soon knocked out her lone remaining engine room. Communications were out throughout the ship, and all of her guns were out of operation with the exception of 5-inch Mount No. 4 that was still firing in local control. She was dead in the water by 9:40, and 5 minutes later Commander Evans gave the order to abandon ship. All of her men that were capable of doing so had left her by about 9:55. Johnston was still being shot at during this time, and she began to come apart in the area where she was struck by Yamato's 18-inch shells. She finally rolled over and sank by the bow at 10:10, several miles behind her task unit and surrounded by the enemy. As Johnston sank, the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze closed, but not for an attack. Instead, her captain and a large number of her crew paid their respects by manning the rails and saluting the valiant U.S. destroyer and her men for their bravery. Of her complement of 327 men, 186 were lost. Commander Ernest E. Evans was observed abandoning ship and was last seen alive in the water with other survivors on the night of the 25th. However, he was never seen again. Evans was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his gallant actions throughout the Battle of Samar. Most of her 141 survivors were rescued on October 27th after they had clung desperately to life rafts for over 50 hours, nearly to the hour that Johnston had been commissioned a year earlier. In October 2019, Johnston's remains were initially discovered at the bottom of the Philippine Trench but could not be positively identified. The remains consisted of a deck gun, a propeller shaft, and some miscellaneous debris, but additional debris was observed lying deeper than the RV could reach. On March 31, 2021, after almost 77 years lying undisturbed on the ocean floor, Johnston was surveyed, photographed, and definitively identified, as her hull number is still quite visible on her bow. Johnston lies at a depth of 21,180 feet, which was the record for the deepest shipwreck ever found at that time. However, she was bumped to second place when Samuel B. Roberts was discovered a year later. Johnston was awarded 6 battle stars for her World War II service and, for the action off Samar, a Presidential Unit citation. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us out, and we greatly appreciate it. Once again, thank you for watching.